Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Faith and Finance Forum, hosted by the Catholic Finance Association and presented by Aquinas Wealth Advisors. We have a great show for you today. We have Father Robert Sirico with us. Father, how are you today?
I'm very well. Hope you are as well.
Okay, thanks for being on the show. Would you mind leading us in a prayer, please?
Sure. Well, today's the feast of the presentation of the Blessed Virgin, so I thought we'd open with the Memorare. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that it never was it known that anyone who fled to thy help, implored thy intercession, was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgin, our Mother. To thee we come, before thee we stand, sinful and sorrowful, O Mother of the Word incarnate. Despise not our petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer us. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Father. Beautiful. So, Father Robert Sirico is the co-founder and President Emeritus of Acton Institute. It is a think tank whose mission is to promote a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. It gets its name from the great English historian Lord John Acton, who was a titan of the 19th century. Father Sirico, thank you so much for being with us today. For our listeners that don't know you as well as some others, would you mind just sharing us a little bit about your biography and your background?
Well, I'll try and keep it very short. I'm writing a whole biography, so autobiography. Let me just say that I was raised in a nominal Italian Catholic family in the 1950s in Brooklyn, New York, which is a very colorful environment. And I went through catechism, and a lot of that remained in my head and in my formation, even during the years from my teens to my mid 20s when I drifted from the church. Part of that drift was an involvement with the political left in California. This would be in the 1970s. I had gone to California, and uh, it was more emotive and activist oriented rather than thought. And I walked into a buzzsaw when I met a friend of a friend of mine who began to ask me questions that forced me to think about my economic commitments, my activist commitments. But it resulted not just in a political conversion, but then eventually my return to the Catholic faith. And I went to seminary in my late 20s, and here I am today. I was very concerned once I got in seminary and seeing that a lot of those ideas that I had flirted with in my early 20s were rife in seminary in the 1980s, liberation theology. Of particular importance to you and your colleagues is the fact that this denounces business and capitalism, free exchange. Um, it sees that wealth is the axiomatic exploitation of people. And as I began to study it theologically, I began to write about it, and then eventually founded the Acton Institute in 1990. I'm succeeded by the co-founder now, Chris Maurin, who providentially enough is 16 years my junior, so he can take it on seamlessly, and the work keeps going. Your colleagues will want to know about the Institute because we really deal with the question of vocation. In fact, we have a beautiful documentary called The Call of the Entrepreneur, which deals a lot with these questions of vocation and enterprise.
Fascinating. Drill down on that a little bit more. What is the call of the entrepreneur about?
Well, it came out of a monograph that I wrote, and then we put it into a video file. It's the story of three business people uh, and their reflections on vocation. The core idea is that as God is the creator of the world, that he is the grand impresario, if you will, that he fashions all things, and then he places man and woman in a garden, not a jungle, which meant that they had to work. They had to tend the garden to make it productive. That this man, this woman are made in the image and likeness of God, which entails, to some extent, creativity and creativity in the marketplace, so that our belief is that the market can be the occasion for the discovery of God. And this video tells these three stories. One of them, interestingly enough, happens to be in the news more recently. Jimmy Lai, who is in prison in Hong Kong. But we had interviewed him, this is probably a 15 or 20-year-old documentary in which he talks about his own vocation vis-a-vis China. So that's available at the Acton Institute website, acton.org.
Let's talk a little bit more about Acton generally. I mean, we've shared the mission statement and some of its history. What does Acton Institute do? Why should our audience be interested in Acton Institute?
Well, I think in particular your audience should be interested because it's both a network of similar-minded entrepreneurs, both, by the way, Catholic and evangelical and increasingly Jewish and some Muslim participants. But it really gives the intellectual heft behind the moral defense of the free economy. What you do every day in the business world has everything to do with your own calling from God, how to touch the presence of God in the real world. You know, the poet Jared Manley Hopkins talks about the world is charged with the power of God. Well, that has to include finance. You know, if Jesus Christ is in fact the Emmanuel, God with us, then he's also God with us on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, or he's not Emmanuel. And I think what you'd find there is an articulation of what you know intuitively. And so for those who have not had the opportunity to study philosophy or theology, it's broken down in ways that you can grasp and understand. And if you go on our website, you'll see the plethora of programs and seminars that we have, both for business people and seminarians and just regular folk.
Outstanding. You know, Father, going back to your biography a little bit, for those of you, our audience, that know you well and know the Acton Institute well and read your books, it might be a little surprising to know that you were a left-wing activist early in your life. Talk
I
to us a
knew
little
Jane
bit.
Fonda and Tom Hayden.
Yeah, right on, right on.
Yeah.
What was it about leftist ideology in your youth that attracted you? Will you talk a little bit about that?
The appeal to justice, you know,
Hmm.
really at its root, as wronghead as it may be, at its root, the left is speaking in moral categories. They talk about injustice in the world, unfairness, the poor, the vulnerability of people. And those were the things that I was attracted to. I was attracted to it because in New York, one of my first memories was an encounter I had with a neighbor who lived just right across from us, who gave me some cookies and had on her arm a series of tattooed numbers. She was a Holocaust survivor. And that etched in my memory the importance of justice in the world, that we don't treat people like objects. And I didn't have any economic background, so I thought, who's calling for the proper treatment of human beings? Who's decrying racism in the world? And it would have been the left. Of course, I was sadly mistaken about not the goal, not the moral impulse, but the means, because the means that socialism offers is exactly the thing that enslaves people, exactly the thing that breeds racism. So it was a real wake-up call for
And
me.
talk to us about how you kind of came around. I mean, you know, how did your views start to evolve?
Well, so this began with an argument with this friend of a friend of mine. And I remember him, you know, after we talked for quite a while, he asked me, well, what is the thing that motivates you? What's so important to you? What would you like to see happen? And I said, well, I'd like to see a massive redistribution of wealth. And he said, okay, let's say we do that. Let's say we distribute the wealth. What happens the next day? I said, well, you know, the people who are impoverished are better off. The people who are very wealthy don't have quite as much, but they still have as much as everybody else. And life can go on. He said, okay, and what happens? I said, well, you know, people go to work. And he said, where do they go to work? I said, well, they go to their jobs. He said, What jobs? And then there was a pause in the conversation. He said, "Oh, I get it." He said, "You think the wealth of that you've just distributed is in the boats and in the cars and the jewelry of these people. Don't you realize that it's invested in business? It's invested." And I have to admit that I just had never thought that far. It's embarrassing to think about that now. But when he began to unpack that for me and showed me that capital was not the same thing as property, that what Marx was after wasn't your toothbrush, it was your capital. And what's the difference? The difference is the property is the fish, the capital is the net, it's the means of production. And that's what Marx wanted. And if you're really going to redistribute wealth, you're going to redistribute and control the means of production. Well, that means that people will have to go to the state for their work. And we've seen how that's worked out in the last century. So as I began to think that through, the economic dimension of it, for some reason, recalled or caused me to recall the teaching that I had in catechism about the human person, what man was made for, and the dignity of work. And it must have been a period of 6 months before I went to confession, maybe more. I remember it shocked the priest because he was just coming over to go out to dinner. It was somebody I knew from social and political connections. And I said, "Before we go out to dinner, I'd like to go to confession." And he was a professor, a philosopher at Fordham University, a Jesuit. And I said, "Bless me, Father, for I have since been 13 years since my last confession." He looked at his watch. And it wasn't the warmest, most cuddly confession, but I realized enough, even at that time, even having been away from the church, that the personality of the priest wasn't what was important. It was that I was confessing to Almighty God.
Hmm.
And he absolved me, and I just began going back to Mass, and then grew in my faith, and eventually then went to seminary.
That's beautiful. And let's talk a little bit about the era in like the 1980s when you were, at Catholic University of America, and then, perhaps beyond. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you were a guest at these famous Michael Novak dinner parties. Do I have that correct?
Was
What was
not
that like?
only a guest, I cooked at a lot of them.
Oh wow.
My Italian family, I have no training in culinary arts, but I knew how to make a good antipasto or a
Yeah.
good chicken cacciatore. And at that time, of course, Michael Novak conducted a kind of salon, if you will,
Right.
and very interesting people, Irving Kristol and his wife, Bea Himmelfarb, who was a very well-known scholar in her own right, and Jack Kemp and Charles Krauthammer, and who else was there? The other Novak, also Claire Booth Luce. I don't know if people remember who she is. She was the first ambassador to, well, she was a female ambassador to Italy, and she was a convert, one of Fulton Sheen's converts to the church. She was also a writer, fascinating lady. She was the one who said she was an enthusiastic convert, and she was meeting as the ambassador of Italy to ambassador of the United States to Italy. She met John the 23rd, and she was going on about Catholicism, and finally he said to her, yes, I understand, Mrs. Luce, but I am already a Catholic." She was formidable even in her later years, which is when I met her. I remember a debate that she was having at the table with a bunch of people. And Novak, of course, became such a very good friend of mine. George Weigel was at these meetings. George remains a good friend of mine.
I think it's so fascinating. You compared it, of course, to the salon, which was probably a great way to look at it. I mean, what was the format like? I'm just curious. I mean, was it very casual, very informal?
No, no, it was very casual.
Okay,
It
okay,
was around a big dining room
yeah,
table. And of course, the whole house was filled with books,
wow,
piled wild with books. and Michael's study was just off the living room, and we'd sit around at first and have some cocktails. Novak loved Manhattans, and so he taught me to love Manhattans. And I'd have come over. I would have come over earlier in the day and gone shopping at the Italian negozio, the grocery store, and bought all the makings for everything and got it all going. And people would just sit, and I was a seminarian. I just listened and took notes. I mean, occasionally I get into discussion. I remember I was in conversation with Bob, I'm sorry, Bork, uh, Mary Ellen and Bob Bork. Bob Bork, oh goodness, his name's just gone out of my
No,
head.
you got it. Robert Bork, Judge Bork.
Robert Bork, Robert, there
Yeah,
you go.
yeah.
I was saying Bob, yeah. And we were talking, and I recommended that he read, because he was talking about how law develops, and I recommended that he read on the development of Christian doctrine by, this was before he converted to Catholicism. And he said, well, thank you. That's, I've heard of that book. And I kind of gave him basically my class notes on it. And he read it. I hope that had some role to play. Of course, I think that Mary Ellen had a great deal to do with it too. She was a really wonderful, wonderful woman who I have known over the years.
I wonder if that kind of like spontaneous, casual, just thought exchange still occurs as frequently as it once did. What do you think, Father?
It does in my house. I mean, I go
Okay,
out of my way. Well, in fact, the Acton Institute is like that. I mean,
okay.
it's that kind of gathering of people with ideas. I mean, when we would sit at the Novak table, there was no agenda. There were just people who were writing about interesting things, and they would just compare notes, or they'd have debates among themselves. That's the other thing. It wasn't lockstep, everybody agrees with everything. We had all kinds of debates on any number of topics, ranging not just from economics, but theology and art and literature and the illusions. It was it was just a great experience, and everybody had a little edge over everybody else because they were experts in different fields. So, and people knew how to listen and argue, really argue with one another, not just fight with one another, which is what we see today on a lot of the news programs.
Could you talk to us a little bit about that specifically? Because I mean, that's one of my great frustrations, Father. I have always just loved hearing other points of view. I mean,
Sure,
I genuinely sometimes I'll turn on a TV show or read a newspaper that I know is conflicting with my own views because I just think
sure,
that's more stimulating. I think it, it challenges me more, etc. It doesn't seem like that happens as much as it once did. It seems like you're right. It's more common for somebody to see somebody who disagrees with them or sees the world a little differently as some kind of adversary and someone I couldn't even consider what they had to say.
right.
That type of decorum has really broken down a little bit. But it sounds like you're wired differently. It sounds like you actually enjoy spending time with somebody that sees the world a little differently, disagrees with you. Talk to us about the kind of listening you do, the kind of engagement you
Yeah.
do with somebody that doesn't necessarily agree with your point of view.
Well, I guess that came from my dad, who was a laborer. He worked on the roofs, and but we would sit down. Like many people in my generation, I was my father's remote control. I'd get up and change the channel. This is before we had even the remote controls. Anyway, I always remember watching Firing Line with him. And, a lot of it was boring because if you're not familiar with the language or that level of language, but somehow it seeped in. And the more you listen to it, and then I began to read the New York Times regularly. Um, and let me express one of my great laments right now, which is along this line, and that is what has happened to the New York Times and what has happened to National Public Radio. Those are my two go-to sources for information in the world. Now, of course, I disagreed with things I read in it, but boy, it sharpened my vocabulary. It also displayed a dignified way of disagreeing because there were certain, but it has become very smug, and they don't entertain or very often entertain different points of view. So much so, I just wrote an article that was published on the Fox News site about the smugness of NPR during the lead up to the aftermath of the abortion decision. They don't even know that they don't know other people's points of view. And I just don't find that stimulating. And I have always gone out of my way to, I mean, both having been on the left for a while, and I retain some of those friendships, but even there it's become so polarized that if you say something, then you're excommunicated. And among the Catholics that I do know, I really ask them to think about things that are broader than our comfortable categories.
And what are some news sources that you turn to? I mean, if the New York Times and NPR, are kind of disappointing you these days, where do you go to consume news?
I go everywhere. I mean, I like the fact that Drudge has a lot of different sources. I don't like very often the sensationalist headlines and the sloppiness in that regard. But if there's any one place that gives you a variety of sources to go to, there's that. And I guess I've just accumulated over the years people I go to. I think the best source of Catholic news is probably the Catholic World Report. I think they have the most balanced and intelligent kind of looking at things. National Catholic Register. When I feel that I need to get my digestive juices going, I'll look at the Catholic Reporter, the National Catholic Reporter. America is a little more sophisticated. But again, I think there are blind spots there. Every now and then with the Jesuits, you see them trying to break out of their blind spots, but the momentum seems so entrenched that you couldn't have an article on America's website now that would just argue the church's case on human sexuality. That would just be verboten. I would think. I mean, I haven't seen it recently, but then I'm not a regular. So those are the places, and a lot of my own personal network of friends who are kind of like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, sometimes the best person to go to is a friend or colleague who's just in the thick of it. Going back to the Novak dinner parties. I mean, if you had somebody across the table that was the foremost expert or knew that space well, just pick up the phone and have a conversation. What do you think about this? Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
So,
people
Father, yeah, go
get
ahead.
locked into things, especially
Hmm.
when they're podcasting or they're writing, and they have to
Yeah.
be the leader of the charge. And I know a number of these people whose names I won't mention, but when you get them in private, they're willing to consider other ideas, but on the front lines, they have to maintain the brand.
Yeah, absolutely. Father, I would be remiss if I didn't, touch upon your most recent book, The Economics of the Parables.
Yes.
It's a very interesting book. There's 13 central stories that cover parables from the Bible, and you analyze their, just their implications with economics, and you unpack them a little bit. Talk to us a little bit about the economics of the parables and what you were trying to accomplish with that book.
Well, let me say first what I was not trying to do, because I think just from the title, it sounds like what I'm saying is, here's Jesus' economic theory. And that's not at all what I'm attempting to do. I begin with economics not as ideology, but as human discernment, human action. The reason people act economically is because we live in the world of scarcity. So we have to make choices. We have to have trade-offs. And that applies today, and it applied in the time of Jesus because it's a fundamental human existential reality. So when Jesus attempts to articulate the kingdom of God, he very often begins with that familiar phrase, the kingdom of God may be likened unto, and then he goes and tells a story. And this story, at least in these 13, and there are others that I didn't include here, he tells a story that has to do with things like contract disputes or inheritance disputes or supply and demand or the necessity to plan what you're building and where to build it. The appreciation that Jesus has of merchants, the pearl of great price. I mean, the fact that it was a, a valued object, remember, it takes place in a market setting. He's buying it from someone who has it. It required a knowledge of pearls for him to see that this was of great price. This was a valuable pearl. Remember that pearls in the ancient world were not manufactured. They had to be taken out of nature, and yet this man discovers a pearl not in nature, but in the market. And then he's willing to risk. He sells all that he has in order to obtain this pearl of great price. This, and it's a luxury good, by the way. I look at the backdrop of it and not what Jesus is saying, but then you derive from it and say, well, isn't that interesting that he's likening the kingdom of God to a luxury object? And so I go through them all just from my knowledge of economics and, of course, my knowledge of the parables, because I've been preaching on them the whole of my priesthood. And I try and just pull out these implications without eisegeting. Eisegeting is when you read into the text something. Exegeting, what's Jesus saying? What's the fundamental teaching here, which I say over and over again in the various parables? It's not a difficult book to read, because it has these beautiful stories, and especially for people who are familiar with markets, they're going to recognize some familiar themes.
Why do you think Jesus was so inclined to teach using parables?
Because he was the incarnated Son of God. By that I mean, our redemption did not take place from outside of our world. Jesus is not E.T., right? He didn't come from some extraterrestrial reality. He was born of the Virgin Mary. He's in the context of time. Again, it goes back to the creation that God makes, fashions the material world. And Jesus also gives us the material world as the normative means by which we are saved. What do I mean by that? I mean the sacraments. I mean, consider that bread and wine, not grapes and grain, but bread and wine. What's the difference? Bread and wine's undergone human transformation. So it's human work. And it's through that he gives us his presence in the Holy Eucharist. Or marriage. There's a material dimension to marriage, right? And I don't mean the wedding band, much less the unity candle, but the conjugal union of husband and wife, sex, becomes the matter of the sacrament. That's the way in which grace is communicated to the couple. So, of course, Jesus, in a lesser sacramental sense, is going to use the sacramentality of the world in which he came to redeem.
Indeed. And Father, so much of Jesus's teaching can be misconstrued and perhaps interpreted in a way that validates the thesis of the left, right? I mean, Jesus is often, many of his quotes and teachings are confused to support Marxist
Yeah.
thinking. Give your counter to that. Why was Jesus, in fact, not a Marxist?
Well, probably the last fourth of the book deals with themes outside of the parables. It deals with the general economics of the New Testament. And I handle some of those, the question of didn't the early church hold all things common? Isn't
Sure.
that the economic model? And you look into it and you find, well, the fact that people shared things doesn't mean that private property was abolished. That you read the Acts and you see, no, of course it's still property. If I were to come up with one bumper sticker refutation of the socialism of Jesus or the early church, it would be Churchill. Churchill said it very well. Winston Churchill, in 1908, he said that the socialism of the early Christians said everything that is mine is yours. But the modern socialism says everything that is yours is mine. And the difference is coercion. What Christ comes to do in teaching us to be mindful of the needs of others is to convert our hearts, to compel us by virtue of our conviction to be generous to others. What socialism today does, the ideology of socialism, Marxism, is a coercive redistribution, the taking of your property and the giving of it to another. Now I ask you, even if the other person is benefited, economically speaking, by the expropriation of your property, what does that do for your morality? Does that exalt are you a better person because you've had your money taken from you? And I think that's the genius of Christ, is that he converts our hearts. It doesn't coerce us.
So conversely, the other driving force in modernity is global capitalism. The United States and other liberal democracies in what they would describe as a free market economy,
Right.
oppositional to communism. I think
Yes.
we would all agree. What's your critique of that? Its morality, its effectiveness, its tendency to promote human flourishing. How would you critique global capitalism as another driving force in economics?
I think there's a difference, and I think there's a lot of people, especially in the political conversation in recent years, a difference between economic globalization and political globalism, so that you have a lot of political overlay and control on what would otherwise be a very natural reciprocity that the market always displays. When people come to a market, I'd rather have that bar of soap than this dollar, and you'd rather have the dollar than the bar of soap, so we exchange. I think that can happen globally in a relatively lightly regulated market. What we have now in what I think you mean, or what people mean by global capitalism, is a highly regulated market through the World Bank, through the UN, through these international accords that are supposed to be free market and really precisely restrict markets to the benefit of special interests. This is antithetical to free exchange. It's politically managed exchange. And in politics, it's the person with the most power and the most pull that gets the benefits. So I think we need to parse these things out. And in the political debate, so much of it is profoundly confused because they don't make this distinction between political globalism and what I'm calling economic globalization.
So if those kind of supranational institutions and regulatory entities that you just mentioned are undermining the free market and making the aspiration of capitalism harder to attain, what reforms would you enact? I mean, what changes would you make if you had the ability to do so to have a more free market and enjoy the benefits of capitalism to a greater degree?
Well, that's an enormous question. By the way, the Acton Institute produced a documentary dealing with international poverty, which deals with a lot of these questions. It's called Poverty Inc. Um, uh, if I were to, again, to try and sum it up, I would say I would ask people to really think about the principle of subsidiarity.
Mm.
The subsidiarity says that needs are best met at the most local level possible, and that in terms of government, intervention at higher levels of state organization is justified only when there's a manifest failure at local levels. So I would say that uh, even on the international level, we can apply the principle of subsidiarity and again have central governments act only when there's some kind of crisis at lower levels, and then to withdraw themselves once the crisis has been resolved, so that the natural society, that is the social structures, the infrastructures, and also business itself can coordinate the resource. I mean, business knows better. The free pricing system knows better the relative cost of producing things than any agency of the United Nations or some federal government, because what prices communicate are the hard realities on the ground. And what people don't think of when they think of prices is that it's really an information flow. It's not the arbitrary dictate of a capitalist. It's the response to a market. It's the response to consumers at the local level who say, yes, I need this. I need more of this, or I can do without that because it's too expensive, that kind of thing.
You might say this differently, and I'd like you to, edit me to the degree that you would. But when I look at the past 200 years of international history, the impulse around creating these, supranational, institutions that's been most popular and most rational, I think, is the prevention of war. The notion that if you bring states together to work out their issues in a common forum and create close trade relationships where they talk to each other and they talk about their disputes rather than fighting wars, that would be beneficial to humanity, and to me that makes sense. And that
Yes,
seems like it's always the rationale for creating the United Nations or NATO or whatever, European Common Market, whatever supranational institution you want to describe. But it sounds like you believe that's gone too far. That maybe it's waded into territory far beyond that acceptable premise, and it's gone into areas that nobody ever agreed to. Am I
no,
saying that right? How would you say it?
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you've put your finger right on it. A more contemporary example, maybe in the memory of most of us, certainly within my memory, is the whole EU. I mean, you don't believe in the European Union? Of course, I believe in the European Union. And by the way, I am a European citizen as well. I hold dual citizenship. What I don't like is having, uh, you know, uh, the central EU bureaucrats telling a person in England how they should weigh their potatoes. And that's what you have. I think markets can negotiate all of that. I don't think you need bureaucrats, centralized bureaucrats in Brussels to tell people these kinds of things. So you see what happened with Maastricht Treaty. They use interesting in the Maastricht debates were the debates over the formation of the EU. And they use the word subsidiarity, but when you go to the documents, you see that they really are inverting subsidiarity, that the state, the central planners, have the right to intervene first, and then they'll leave it to everybody else what they're not controlling. And I think that's a mistake. I think we could have a good, rich European community. We could have a good, rich international community and have a debating society that exposes the injustices and helps people to negotiate, honest brokers negotiating peaceful settlements. And keep in mind, too, that while it's not infallible, the incentive to settle things peacefully comes much more from markets, because when goods cross borders, armies have less incentive to do so, because if you send troops in, you're not going to have the availability of the goods that that country produces. And that's why, in general, though not 100% of the time, I'm in favor of free trade and not sanctions. This does not apply to people who are producing goods and services in slave labor and where the state is the principal um, capitalist in a given country. So again, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What starts as a very reasonable conversation among different countries, once the professionals get in there, they begin to feather their nest.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Father, one of the trends that I think we should all be happy about is that relatively poverty has decreased in our own country and in much of the rest of the world throughout our lifetimes.
Incredible.
Eh,
In
yeah.
the 200 years that you identified, incredibly
Who
reduced.
who
I mean,
gets the credit for that, Father?
oh, what, the UN?
Well,
Care packages,
yeah. Well,
charity?
what developments in our civilization have led to that type of historic progression in eliminating poverty, which we'd all like to see? Why did it occur?
Why did it occur? It occurred because people left people relatively free to produce, to retain property. Then, of course, what that produced was the technology, and then the technology built on itself. But all of that starts with a relatively free exchange model. But even back 200 years ago, you have Adam Smith warning about mercantilism, warning about these kind of state capitalist or governmental or even financial institutions that block the economy from functioning, that impose upon people certain regulations or barriers and tariffs and things like that.
You're a fan of technology, I think, and just recently,
Generally,
just last week, I actually came from the Catholic Crypto Conference, and the Acton
yes.
Institute was well represented there. Many of your scholars were there,
Good.
leading the thought conversation. Talk to us generally about your attitudes towards technology, the phenomena that we call in the United States big tech, and also the what's on the cutting edge. Blockchain, cryptocurrency, digital assets, et cetera. What are your thoughts on these cutting edge topics?
Whew, that's a real swath of things. Um, I don't think the blockchain is going anywhere. I think it's gonna be indispensable, and that'll become very apparent. I think this recent dip with cryptocurrency, as we're just seeing over the weekend, had a lot to do with the woke mentality, this appeal to a false altruism. And I've forgotten this guy's name, the letters of his name. But he said, it's the whole woke ideology. That's our game. That's our brand. I think ultimately, uh, when those kinds of currencies, if we're talking about cryptocurrencies, when those kinds of currencies, dissolve on the basis of their own internal contradictions, the technologies that are really responding to the market are going to survive because it's just an efficient way of operating. More broadly speaking, with regard to technology, though, I think that one of the important things is that children be protected from that kind of habituation at early ages until they can be formed in logical ways of thinking. I think part of the insanity, indeed the stupidity of our current cultural situation is that a lot of people have become very proficient in technology and have neglected the hard work of reasoning and thinking through arguments and uh, being able to work through your interior frustrations to a solution. And that has to come when a young person's brain is in its formative stages. So you have to habituate the brain to delay gratification, to stay with an argument, or stay with a piece of literature or a piece of music or a piece of art and probe it and think it through rather than just jump from headline to headline, which is what the technology does. And then I think later you can come back to it. Then you are the master of the technology, and the technology isn't your master. It isn't your God that you look to. So I don't know. You hit me a lot of questions there. I don't know if I covered them all.
No, it's well stated, and actually opens up a new conduit, which is education and preparation of the next generation, which I know is another passion of yours.
Yes,
You're a fan of classical education.
ma'am.
I believe your institution you've been involved in Michigan is the Sacred Heart Academy. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
What are some of your principles and ideas around education, the best way to prepare the rising generation?
Well, I think classical education says it all. I mean, if it's not just teaching children what to think. It's not putting data into their head, but teaching them how to think. And that requires, as I say, the formation of the brain and the formation of the soul, because we're not just physical entities. Um, Classical education deals in great part with the necessity of contemplation. In our school, for instance, every day, children begin with the celebration of the Holy Mass. And by that, I don't mean kids' masses. It's not all of this stuff. It's lots of silence, a good bit of Latin too, which they're learning in school, so they hear it reinforced in prayer. And what the teachers say is that the kids come in calmer because they're taught what to do with downtime, what to do with boredom. What do you do with that? And if you know some of the principles of meditation and contemplation, then that can apply when you're reading a great book or hearing a recitation and committing recitations to memory. It's really impressive when you see kids in the 6th grade stand up and do a 15-minute powerful recitation with the emotion and everything associated with it from, I don't know, Shakespeare or the Odyssey or something like that. And they treat people like human beings. I mean, it really has to do not just with curriculum, that's important, but it has to do more broadly with culture. And so what I see in the school isn't just a set of regulations saying to kids to treat each other fairly or decently, but they're being held accountable by other students because they all buy into this ethos. And it's not a cult. A cult doesn't let you think outside of itself. These kids can think outside of their own frame of reference, and that's what breeds respect. If people are interested in this, go on the Sacred Heart of Jesus Academy website in Grand Rapids. There are a number of Sacred Heart of Jesuses around the country, and see the curriculum, see the principles, see the kids. I have to say, I had never been in a parish with a school before. This was the first time that I'd encountered it. It was a dying school. We had 68 kids in the school. And when we transformed it, today there are 400 kids in the school that go to Mass every day. I didn't know anything about education in a formal sense, but I saw the families and I had the intuition that those families had, and they came together and formed this community.
Where did, mass public education go wrong? I mean, like, why did we forget those basic elements, like the ones that you just described? I mean, like, for my own children, when you were describing, the young person that recited the Shakespeare with great passion and competence, I mean, if my child ever does that, that will bring me to tears. That'll be one of the proudest moments of my life. Where did we lose our way and get so confused and distracted by the stuff that perhaps non-classical curriculums spend their time on with children?
Well, I hate to go hark back to the first principles, but it's the politicization of
Yeah.
society and the politicization of our school system. And a lot of people hang it around Dewey and that whole the professionalization of education, rather than families involved with children and then teaching children how to teach themselves or to teach each other. Uh, that kind of, now it's really on stilts with the whole woke thing where everything. Our school, one of the first things we did other than Mass every day was we rejected the federal hot lunch program, because we knew if we were taking that money, they were going to tell us, if we're putting food into you, then we're going to tell you how you can take it out of you, i.e. the bathrooms. That was down the line. I knew they were going to tell us how we can operate in terms of the whole gender debates. I also let go 3 public school teachers because the contract with the public school in Michigan meant that the public schools would rent a classroom and provide the teachers and all of the costs, but the pastor had no say in who was coming or what they were teaching. And the school room had to remove the crucifix and the statues of Our Lady and things like that. And I said, well, we'll get rid of that, which was, very expensive to replace 3 teachers. And then when the shutdown came, we refused the PPP money because we made it work. We made it work, and it was hard. It was very hard for everybody. But it was I think $1.5 million or $2 million we were being offered. All I had to do was sign my name. All of the work had been done. And I said no, and they came back 2 or 3 times and said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah, no, we're not gonna do it. We're gonna get through this." The school grew 120 students just during COVID. So that sense of independence, that sense of pride that we will make this work, is it takes account of the whole of the human person. And I think what happened in our school system, like what happens in medicine, we just treat people who come to the hospital as patients rather than as people. And that's the same thing with a student. Just jamming information in their heads isn't forming a human being who can cooperate with other human beings in an intelligent way.
Father Sirico, the mission of the Catholic Finance Association in this program is to help Catholic business leaders integrate their faith more into their life and become stronger in their faith. What guidance or suggestions would you give to our listeners who are financial advisors, wealth managers, corporate executives, entrepreneurs, who are trying to live their vocation more fully and integrate their strong faith into their business practice?
Well, one of the things I would say, and I say this in the confessional when I get people in there, is you have to have a basic regimen of prayer. By that, I don't mean an hour a day. I don't think it's practical to think that people are raising families and raising, money to support those families have a great deal of time to do that. Then St. Francis de Sales has a whole meditation on this in his book, The Introduction of the Devout Life. But what I mean is a regular regimen of prayer whereby you are praying every day, and a component of that prayer should not just be rote prayer, but should be meditative prayer. And what meditation does, and people say, well, my mind drifts. Let it drift. You bring it back gently, but let it go, because the creativity enables you to think beyond the immediacy of the moment, of just the bottom line. And by putting yourself in the Gospels and seeing yourself in the encounter with Jesus and various people. And then as part of your prayer regimen, so morning and evening, also do an examination of conscience every day. Very simple examination of conscience. What have I done today that I should not have done? What have I left undone that I ought to have done? The examination of the sins of commission and omission. You begin with that and do that for 6 months. Go to confession on a regular basis, by which I don't mean every 6 months, but every few weeks. Even when you don't have a crisis. I mean, the confessional doesn't have to be a place where you have a great spiritual crisis. You just confess these, annoying habits of being impatient with your kids, or being attracted to, sexual fantasies and things like that. Wear away at that. Counter it by admission of your own fault, and having support groups of people who really get you can really be good. Confidential support groups, they exist in an informal way throughout the church, particularly men's groups. There are women's groups that do this too, but women are going to do it different because, by the way, I'm a troglodyte. I believe men are different than women and vice versa. And by having that accountability with men who are struggling with similar things to what you're struggling with, that's the foundation of this integration that you're talking about.
Father Sirico, that was excellent. Thank you so much. And as we approach the end of our time together, take us back, I guess, to the Novak dinner parties. Let's imagine you were going into that tonight, or perhaps one of the comparable ones that sprung up in its way, because I know people have imitated that model throughout the country, which is a beautiful legacy of the Novak dinners. What topic would you raise if you were going tonight to something like that? What would be at the top of
Oh,
your heart and mind?
well, I would raise the crypto. I think that would be very interesting. I mean, that was completely out of the realm of we didn't even have I guess some people had cell phones at that time, but that wasn't general. Certainly, maybe a fax. Um, I would raise the crypto. I would raise the whole political moment uh, of stupidity. It's amazing how intelligent people can act so stupid, where they're not listening to other people, and they can't be happy about cutting people off or demonizing people. And I'm not talking here about Republican versus Democrat. I'm talking about a whole mentality that goes on within politics, but also it's going on in the church. The other thing I find very interesting is talking about the church and the crisis in the church. And how does one retain a mature faith without becoming a sedevacantiist on the one hand, or a, what's the word, Caesaral papist on the other, an ultramontanist on the other. What is the via media, if you will, in the middle of this moment of crisis in the Catholic Church?
All fascinating topics. Father, you mentioned this earlier. You're writing an autobiography. That's going to be a hot book for many of our listeners
I
and
think
people beyond
so.
that. Preview that for us a little bit. What's
Uh,
gonna be like?
well, I'm gonna, I came through a time where certain big moments occurred, and I always managed to insert myself into things. I mean, it's really fascinating as I reflect on my life. And some of the movements that I was part of in the 70s, which I haven't been explicit about. I mean, I haven't been secretive about it, but I haven't written a lot about it because I had a lot of other stuff that I wanted to write about and didn't want to just kind of be pigeonholed in one ghetto or another. I'm going to write about that from my perspective now, but to try and do it in an honest way of what I was thinking at the time and the people that I encountered. I met, as I mentioned, Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden. I had an encounter with, don't ask me about it because I'm not going to tell you, I'm saving for the book. I had an encounter with Jim Jones. Um, uh, just people in the world of politics, in the world of religion, across the board. Um, and to come to, begin a think tank 3 years ago now, dealing with these questions of economy, and ending on the school that we talked about. And what are the issues that run through that? Questions of identity. I think that's a real thing. Who am I? Who am I? Who are we? That's the question that people ask themselves. And the sadness is people don't know how to answer that. And so they look for chemical or even surgical remedies to that question, to great disastrous effect. So if I can touch on those things in a winsome way, like Bill Buckley would do, like Michael Novak would do, but in an intelligent way and in a way that references the truths of the tradition, then I will die a happy man. If I die today, let me tell you, let this be on the record. I have lived a very, very blessed life. And for it to culminate now on the heels of so much good that I've seen, um, I just pray that I have the graces at the end to be received uh, by a
Any
mercy of God.
any timeline for the book?
Oh, no, no, no. I'm
Okay.
just talking with the agents now
Okay.
and just begun the faintest outline. It's all in my head and in my memory.
Okay, well, good luck with that, and
Thank you.
can't wait to read it. Sorry to hear about your brother Tony
Thank you.
passing. He was known to so many of us for his, acclaimed acting career, Polly Walnuts and Sopranos. Any anecdote or just memory you want to share about Tony, who was such a famous person?
Well, it's what I related in the homily at the funeral. I did the funeral in our parish in Brooklyn where my parents had been married. Both were buried from that parish. I celebrated my first mass, and then my brother's funeral was there. Um, at my first mass, at the party afterwards, you have to picture the Godfather scene for the marriage. This is what it was like, an Italian uh, son being ordained a priest. My brother was there in a white suit. This was before The Sopranos. And my aunt came over to him and she said, Junior, this is your brother's first Mass and you didn't receive Holy Communion. And he said, I didn't go to confession. And I said to my brother, Junior, we used to call him Junior. I said, Junior, you're the last bad Catholic in America. Everybody else thinks they're entitled to this. At least you knew that you had to prepare yourself. Well, what I told him the homily was about 2 or 3 weeks before he died. I went to see him in Florida, and he was failing. I could see he was failing. And I said to him, Junior, how about that confession?
Mm.
And he went to confession. And what I said in the homily was, the good thief on the side of Jesus at the end of his life just said, remember me. I said, my friends, if Paulie Walnuts could steal heaven, so can you and I.
Mm. So good.
That was, I mean, his life, his witness was able to preach the homily.
Father Sirico, we're out of time, regrettably. So just thank you so much for being with us today. For those of us that would like to, consume more of your content, we know Acton Institute and its website is widely available. Great content there. I hope everybody checks it out. Do you have a social media property or some other place that you'd like us to direct people to?
I don't do it professionally, but I very often tweet, and I have a Facebook page, but I'm not a big, technology person in that regard. But I repost articles and stuff. A lot of my articles have appeared recently in Fox News because the New York Times doesn't ask me to write like they used to. So
they're lost, Father. And don't forget, Father Sirico's most recent book, The Economics of the Parables, is available at your favorite bookstore or Amazon, or wherever you purchase your books. Folks, this has been the Faith and Finance Forum, hosted by the Catholic Finance Association, brought to you by Aquinas Wealth Advisors. We've had Father Robert Sirico with us for the hour. Thank you so much, Father. God bless you.
God bless you all.
Talk to you soon.